It's nearly a year since state governments introduced emergency powers to combat the pandemic. We've never seen governments impose so many restrictions and curbs on our freedoms, certainly outside wartime. And in Western Australia, Mark McGowan today is talking about keeping border controls in place permanently. It's a hell of a worry. One strong global voice raising concerns about all this is Naomi Wolf. She's the author, feminist and leftist activist, and she's been raising the alarm about the overreach of governments imposing pandemic lockdowns and restricting freedoms right around the world. And she joined me earlier from New York. Naomi Wolf, it's so good to talk to you. We so often hear people talk about the pandemic pitting health versus the economy, but it really pits personal freedom against community well-being, doesn't it?
That is my view. Look, we live in free democracy, and nowhere in your founding documents in Australia, your basic human rights agreements, nowhere in the Constitution of our United States does it say that our civil liberties can be suspended if there is a bad disease or even a serious health emergency. These are the wrong questions to ask. The real question is, by what right does anyone have the right to restrict the assembly of Australians in any way, let alone in these draconian ways that we've seen, or restrict the free assembly, the First Amendment rights of people here in New York State? Lockdowns are an invention of Xi Jinping. As of March of 2020, they've never existed in history in free societies. They've existed during World War II in the Warsaw Ghetto. They've existed in North Korea, but never before has free societies said, okay, there's a disease, so we get to, central governments get to crush small businesses, keep kids out of school, fine people for going outside or having free assembly. I mean, the illegalities are so multiple. Among other things, they violate the Geneva Conventions, and they violate basic human rights to assembly, to worship, to property rights. Every kind of human right and law is being violated. And I have to say, as I said before we began to talk formally, Australia has a very central place in my heart. I fell in love with your country years ago. It's a beautiful country full of amazing, diverse, incredible, creative people, and it's a democracy, or it was, and it's been painful for me to watch the people of Australia being lied to over and over and tortured, really, psychologically and in other ways, by being told you cannot leave your home, you can't assemble, you can't visit people, you can't run your businesses, you can't educate your kids, and basically your entire democracy has been put on hold, as has ours, for illegal reasons.
You say this from the United States, which has approached this pandemic in a more freewheeling way than many countries and has seen more than 500,000 people die because of the pandemic. What do you say to those who suggest this is the only way to tackle the pandemic and preserve lives?
First of all, a lot of serious people have raised very serious, credible contentions against the way people are tabulating illnesses and deaths. You said that 500,000 people have died. We really don't know that. We can't. Because, for instance, when Minnesota audited the death certificates, they found that there was a 40% overcounting of deaths by attributing deaths from other causes to COVID. The same thing is happening in Britain. The Daily Mail just did a big expose, and many doctors are stepping forward, and this is a story I broke actually months ago, that the way they're recording deaths in Britain means that other causes of death, like dementia, like Alzheimer's, in America, like car accidents, like suicide, are being ascribed to COVID. And the same thing with cases. There are horrible, horrible graphs and charts showing, deadly levels of infection. But the WHO announced in mid-January that the PCR tests, which have been the gold standard for quote-unquote cases or positives, are flawed if you run them above 25 cycles, and that they generate false positives. This has been confirmed by the New York Times as well as the WHO. So really, we don't know what the extent of the pandemic has been at all. Quite question that, we've lived through tuberculosis, polio, HIV, cholera, typhus. You guys have too. Nowhere does it say in the founding of a free society that you get to suspend civil liberties if there's a disease around. That is not how it works in a democracy. So we've been told a lot of lies about the extent and the scale of this. We've been told something that epidemiologists are challenging, which is if you restrict people's movements, you won't have a pandemic. It's not true. And the signers of the Great Barrington Declaration were prescient, I think, in saying, this is very age-related, and younger people should be free to go about their lives, and people who are vulnerable and elderly people with comorbidity should be supported and protected. And it turns out they're right. Here in Columbia County, we're under a state of emergency. There are 6.9 people who die a month in my county. Every death is very sad. The average age is 82, and we have 59 million people in New York State. It's far below the top 8 causes of death. There's not an emergency in my county. So it's not true that America has been particularly freewheeling. America in some states has stuck to the Constitution, as they should, and it is a falsehood, and the data are now in, that restricting people restricts a virus. It's never happened before. It's not happening now. And even if it did, that is not how free societies work. Free societies leave health decisions to adult individuals to decide for themselves. And we need to go back to that, or else we're going to be living in an extension of, communist China. It's that simple. And you guys, frankly, are more at risk, even more at risk than we are, because there is a deep enmeshment of Australia with many trade agreements with China, and more and more is being uncovered about how the Chinese Communist Party is exploiting this crisis to really weaken the West and weaken free democracies. And other bad actors are also jumping on the bandwagon, which always happens in bad actors try to exploit it. So I think we all need to kind of wake up and say, what kind of society do we want to live in, and what kind of society do we want to leave to our kids? The last thing I want to say before I stop, I promise I'll stop, is I'm a former political consultant. I advised the Clinton campaign. I can tell you that every crisis has special interests that try to benefit from it. And it's not the case that people are told literal truths that mirror the emergency about what has to be done. So in every administration, if there's a chance to extend emergency powers, to suppress dissent, to keep people from, marching the street and getting their rights back, to keep fewer and fewer stakeholders at the table, those in power will do it, whether they're on the right or the left, the Bush administration, the Biden administration, President Trump, or your leaders who are respectfully corrupt enough already. So there are many reasons to question the narrative.
Well, this was going to be my next point. You're of the political left. We've seen laws like this introduced under different constitutions and different legislatures in different countries around the world, some governments left of centre, some right of centre. But it's about this propensity for governments to seize additional power when they can, and it's about how citizens claw that back.
You're exactly right. And this is the subject of my book, The End of America, which I just issued an updated introduction to speak to this moment. The temptation to grab power is not partisan. You see Boris Johnson telling the same lies and restricting people in the same ways, being on the right, that you see with the Biden administration, which within a month has, restricted liberties terrifyingly, in my view, and given, the CDC, which is a health agency, powers around property law, around whether kids can go back to school, like invested tyrannical powers in government agencies. You're seeing that around the world. This shouldn't surprise anyone. When I looked at closing democracies throughout history for my book, The End of America, I saw that whether they're on the left, like the Chinese Communist Party, or whether they're on the right, like Mussolini's black shirts, fascists and totalitarian communist governments do the same things. They always take the same 10 steps to destroy democracies, and we're seeing those 10 steps taken at warp speed right now. And what's so depressing is to see people by propaganda, which is designed to terrify people into not daring to say we deserve to have our rights back.
Thanks so much for talking to us, Naomi. I won't say be safe, I'll say be free.
Thank you.
Smart words there from Naomi Wolf. We've got to be careful with this stuff. We need our freedom.